Hello, welcome back. It is very, very sunny here in the East Nuke of Fife. I hope that you are starting to see and feel spring is just on the horizon this weekend. I mean, we were planting trees in a t-shirt. It wasn't that warm, but it was a lot of moving, so we did get quite warm. What a pleasure. And we're nearly at the March equinox, so come on guys, we've pretty much done it. Welcome back. We are this week, I keep saying we, but it wasn't we, it was Andrew. This week, Andrew is chatting with Rafe Kelley from Evolve Move Play. We recorded this back in January 2025. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with Rafe's work, but in case you're not, he's spent years kind of playing around with movement. He combines parkour and martial arts background with a lot of nature-based play and just has a really kind of powerful philosophy of embodied living. So in this episode, I'm about to go and listen to it myself, but in this episode, I think they're going to go into some interesting stuff around parkour, how we teach movement, how perhaps the fitness industry kind of fails people a little bit. I'm quite interested in listening to this, so let's jump on in, and I'll be back at the end, having just listened to it, and we can share our findings.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, Rafe Kelley, thank you very much for taking the time to join today. I was speaking off camera. I just said that you are one of the guests I've been wanting to get for a while, so it means a lot to me that you took the time. Just to orient you, we do have a mixed bag of guests. So, we have doctors and public health professionals and things like that. So just being mindful, they might not all know who you are, and putting you on the spot. Would you mind just sort of giving an introduction of who you are and what you do at Evolve Move Play?
Yeah, so Ball Move Play really started as an expression of my desire to take the parkour practice that I had begun and been doing for, I guess, about 8 years at the time. And the martial arts that I'd been learning since I was a child and my love of spending time in nature. So parkour had a movement in nature aspect to it at the beginning, but it was really associated with the urban environment when it kind of was widely popularized. And so I started taking my practice and going out into the woods, and I really enjoyed it and wanted to bring people into it. And there was this idea of natural movement that was becoming popularized again through the rediscovery of the work of Georges Hubert and Méthode Naturelle. And so that was sort of the original idea, and I was inspired by. I've always had a really strong interest in evolutionary biology and anthropology and things like that. So the ancestral health hypothesis was big. The paleo community. So the fundamental idea was movement is a big part of this conversation around what it means to be healthy in an ancestral way. So we evolved to move, and then play. We evolved to move through play. So I see right behind you on the shelf, you've got The Exuberant Animal by Frank Ferencich. And Frank was an inspiration for me early on. I was also inspired a little bit by Ida Portal. And so, the movement focus, the play focus, the evolutionary focus, and then this background that I had in all these arts. Over time, because we teach sort of week-long retreats, that was a big part of our business model. We ended up finding that people had really profound experiences of transformative personal growth through encountering parkour and martial arts. And we started integrating aspects of contact improv dance and various things. And that transformative power of the event, it it seemed to be more important to the students than any of the specific movement aspects. And kind of hunting that rabbit hole down, I ended up finding first the work of Jordan Peterson and really digging into the importance of narrative and this idea of meaning, right? Like ultimately, why are we doing this practice? We do them for meaning. And then I came across the work of John Vervaeke, who's become a really dear friend of mine and mentor, who I think has even more sort of detailed theory of meaning. And John saw in my work a kind of exemplar of this idea of an ecology of practices for the cultivation of meaning. So over the years of kind of communicating with John and doing this work, I really honed in on the idea that fundamentally what gives meaning to life is our sense of connectedness, and that what we need to be connected to uh, comes down to relationships that are internal to the self. So the body, mind, the different aspects of the psyche. We have our somatic practices. We have our meditative, contemplative practices. All of those are about aligning and integrating and understanding the internal relationships of the self. But then that body mind is also in relationship to an external world. And a lot of times the somatic sort of sphere ends kind of at your skin. And it's like, well, there's this whole world that you need to be able to be competent in. If you want to have a deep sense of connectedness and competence and all those things, it's like, how do you move through the world? So then we can look at that world as a set of landscapes we move through. And that's where a practice like parkour is incredibly powerful. But also we start layering in aspects of wilderness awareness skills and just awareness of the landscape at a really deep level. And then we can think about the world as a landscape of tools that can be manipulated or toys that can be manipulated. And so there's this aspect of how can we use our our unique capacity as human beings to throw and catch and manipulate and make. And so we make fire and we play games with balls and sticks and ropes. Those are the kind of fundamental toys.
Yeah.
And then there's relationships to other people. And so we have the sort of combative martial arts aspect, but instead of seeing it as simply combative, we really see it as part of a species of how do we interact well um, with other living beings. And if you can grapple, if you can dance, um, if you can, you know, really move with somebody else, that to us is foundational to the way we relate to other people or other animals in general. Um, and so that's sort of the physical base of the practice. And then we think about, you know, we can take the kind of somatic structural orientation, and that becomes our meditative and contemplative. We can take um, the manipulative, and that becomes our crafting and our capacity to really work in the world. And then we can take the interactive, the roughhousing and dance, and that becomes really the grounds of like philosophical dialogue,
Mm.
like the ability, right? Jordan Peterson's new book is called We Wrestle with God. So when I spoke with Jordan, I was like, my challenge to you is how could we become the type of people who can wrestle with God if we have never wrestled, right?
Yeah.
It's an embodied capacity that
Mm.
has to be built in the human being such that they can then approach it with abstraction. The abstract has to originate in the concrete. And that's where I think all of Western philosophy has gone wrong right there, is by forgetting that it has
Mm.
to originate there. And, I think it was Seneca. I maybe it was Epictetus, but who said that, and those are both Stoic philosophers, but he said
Yeah.
that that philosophy is wrestling in the mind.
Mm.
And of course, people don't know this, but Plato is not Plato's name, it's his nickname.
Yeah.
But his name was Aristocles. Plato is a wrestler's nickname that he received wrestling, I believe the Isthmian Games, right? So, this is not the Olympic Games, but it's very close in prestige. And this guy had very wide shoulders.
Wide shoulders. Yeah.
So he was called Broad, Plato Broad. And and the the school of philosophy, the academy where Plato has his academy is named before Plato. It's the site of first religious practice, worship of Athena in a grove of olive trees, and then it becomes the site of physical practice. It becomes a place where there's a gymnasia, and it's in the gymnasia that people meet and begin the practice of philosophia under Plato and Socrates. So yeah, long story short, somehow I went from wanting to jump around in the woods with people to creating an ecology of practices
Yeah.
that is something like the embodiment of philosophy.
Hmm. Well, there's a lot to pick apart in that response. I mean, in a positive way, you gave me a lot to work with. I think a lot of what we do is similar, and that I think people don't always have the opportunities to live a sort of physical embodied existence, and that's one of the things that I might not I might not use that exact phrasing in different company, but I think a lot of what we try to solve as well is the same thing. How do we give people an opportunity to get to know their body? Because I think it was Plato who said, there's no greater tragedy than a man who never learns what their body is capable of.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I think about a lot. As a father, as I know you are as well. What opportunities do my children have to move, and what sort of forces are out there? Um, I'd like to go back to the beginning because I was trying to, when I emailed you, I was trying to think of where I first came across, and I think I misspoke in email. I think I said that I heard you on one of Rob Wolf's podcasts back in 2012. But I don't think that was true because actually, I think of it. I'm not sure if you ever made it on his early podcast or at all.
I've never been on Rob Wolf's podcast at all. So
Yeah, so I realized I completely made it up. So I spent the last few days trying to figure out what podcast was it, and I think it must have been Justin Goodhart's
that was,
Well-Rounded Athlete,
yeah, yeah.
which would have been about 2014, I think.
I remember,
Um,
like, yeah.
and
I love. It was an
go ahead.
interesting interview. I'll just jump in really quickly
Yeah,
because
please.
very interesting interview because that was actually the first time that I said that the practice is about the meaning that we extract from it. I said in that interview, um, the purpose of movement practice is unlocking meaningful experience,
Hmm.
and that was not. I was. I guess I was poking at that concept,
Yeah.
right? But that was before I encountered Peterson. It was
Yes.
before I encountered any of these things, and there was a lot of interesting stuff that sort of cohered for me actually in that interview with Justin, um, which unfortunately is not online anymore.
This is the
Love-
point I was going to make. It was really interesting because through the process of going back to try to figure out where it is I'd first come across you, I realized that part of the internet just doesn't exist anymore. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it was a really exciting time. In the late 2000s, early 20 teens, there was just sort of this revival, this almost renaissance of conversation. Obviously, you had CrossFit had kind of come into full maturity there. So that was obviously one of the big discussions. You had these ancestral health models that were coming across, people sort of rediscovering and reinterpreting their own ideas of natural movement and things like that. And it's so interesting for me now because that whole environment, that whole space for discussion doesn't exist anymore. And I think about how people get introduced to these ideas now, and it's almost solely, I guess, through Instagram, through TikTok. Um, I'm not really sure what the environment is now, but it made me quite sad going back and realizing that a lot of that is lost as people were developing their various ideas.
Yeah, I, I often think that just sort of like on a broad cultural level, we made a really big mistake when we moved from sort of self-created community message boards
Yes.
to social media.
Yeah.
Uh, we got a much sort of smoother experience, and it allowed us to connect across multiple spheres more easily. But we ended up collapsing everything to politics in a way,
Yeah.
and we made ourselves prey to these large attention corporations instead of having the internet from the bottom up. And so I'm very nostalgic for the era of the message board and the
Hmm.
blog, and the non-algorithmic video feed, and everyone being able to, like, remember you could share a video on a message board and it wouldn't decrease its reach on the message board
Yeah.
because the message
I
board didn't have a vested interest in harvesting your attention to sell it to an advertiser. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't this closed environment, this platform. It's old now, but Yancey Strickler put out that article probably about 4 or 5 years ago. The internet is a dark forest, and he was sort of talking about the need to find uh, these spaces where people can really recreate these dialogues without the fear of context collapse, without the fear of the algorithm sort of drawing everything into become a heated debate. And I do miss that, and I think it's a shame Also, just the draw of the algorithm is something that we find as well, where if one is trying to get the word out through Instagram or something like that, you're beholden to it. And I think we've seen this over and over and over again. People who I think are very interesting thinkers in this space always their message often gets contorted, through algorithmic capture before you see it. People sort of become parodies of whatever they once were. And I
Yeah.
think we saw that happen with a lot of the ancestral health movement, where there are
Liver
these
King.
perverse incentives. Sorry.
I said Liver King.
Well, yeah, Liver King is exactly what I was thinking of. It's just this way, this sometimes they talk about flanderization, but just yeah, this exaggerated caricature of something that never actually existed back in 2009, but before his demise, and he just became whatever a reality TV star or something like that. That's kind of what it all got distilled down to in the end. But the reason I was thinking about that is because, and one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you specifically is you wrote a series of articles back in 2024, and you just had this real burst for whatever reason, where I think you wrote this series of 4 or 5 articles that just came out at the right time for me, because I was kind of grappling with how I was trying to make sense of movement, and how I wanted to talk about movement, specifically movement embedded in a community setting. And you had these series of articles, and I just want to read them out. I'll put them in the show notes, but just so we have that as a reference. So back in January, you put out Balancing the Romantic and the Classical Training Methods. Why is movement the root of all self-development? Rusticity, the body built for nature by nature, aliveness and movement, and then CrossFit movement culture and the rise of the generalist mover. And I don't know what was going through your mind. I don't know what sort of project you were working on, but you just hit all these points that just seemed to be perfectly aligned with things that I was thinking about. And I kind of have this joke that whenever I talk to Jill, my business partner and wife, that you're always 5 or 6 years ahead of me on the way you synthesize things. And
Mhm.
I think for me, one of the things I've always admired is I do think you have this real talent for synthesis of taking disparate ideas and turning them into something coherent. So I was re-listening to your podcast with Cliff Harsky um,
That's
the other
fun.
day, and I thought that was a very good one. And one of the things that immediately jumped out at me was your conversation, also based on something that Frank Forensich talked about in the past, but this tension between romantic and classical, or romantic and practical, I guess, fitness modalities, models, practices, whatever you want to call it. Could you kind of explain that tension as you understand it? And I would just like to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, Cliff and I think use that differently, which is interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
We end up, some sort of parallax on maybe an underlying phenomenon there. I got that initially from Frank. It was an
Yeah.
essay that Frank wrote. And so I picked that up and just thought about this idea of, I suppose maybe you could say that, hmm, here's another analogy that might work.
Hmm.
Have you ever heard anyone talk about the difference between cooks and bakers?
No.
So a baker, like really high level professional bakers are chemists,
Yes.
right?
Okay.
They're incredibly precise
Hmm.
about every aspect of it, right? So,
Yeah.
we're going to do, um, we're not going to use volumetric measuring. We have to
Yeah.
use actual mass measuring, very finely tuned. We're going to learn, the difference between, how the effect of baking soda when it's 60 degrees and
Yes.
100 degrees in the kitchen, and all of these things. And then we're going to get a really, really precise product. Whereas a cook, you know, is somebody who enjoys the process of cooking and is sort of creating the art as they do it. Um, and so that kind of points us to this idea of the classical and the romantic. We've all heard the stories of like someone's old nonna who has the best food. Every time she makes something, it's just the most amazing food. And you ask her for the recipe, and she laughs at you, right?
Yeah.
The recipe is her feel, right?
Hmm.
It's an entirely intuitive sense. And so we have these tools of modern science now. We have tools of quantification. I wear a wearable.
Yeah.
I wear a Fitbit. My Fitbit tells me how many zone minutes I've gotten in a week. And so I have an awareness that if I push past a certain threshold, that my recovery numbers are going to start dropping. And then I can be strategic about, okay, here's what I need to do to pick that up, or I need to really attend to my sleep because I know that I'm pushing the edge of this. Um, you know, uh, I go train with barbells, right? And I can go in and I can say, hey, I'm going to add 2.5 pounds to uh, overhead press this week. I can be
Mhm.
really, really fine tuned with it. I can go look at my, I can say, hey, this felt like almost a complete effort, and and so I'm going to use that as my training max, and I'm going to calculate this number of my training max, which should mean that I'm not, reaching these higher threshold motor units, which are going to fatigue my nervous system. So this is going to be a light workout. So all of that kind of stuff I would think of as classical. Um, and I think it's really, really powerful. What I notice is that when I become hyper focused on these classical metrics, I tend to lose joy in my practice. I tend to lose sight of what makes it special, and it tends to. It's actually just easier to do in a gym than it is to do out in nature, right?
Yes.
Um, so I can say, hey, today I'm going to jump. Last week I jumped 9 feet 4 inches on my standing precision. So this week I'm going to try to jump 9 feet 5 inches. Now I'll go to the park and I'm going to climb a tree and I'm going to try to bend a cedar tree to another cedar tree. I mean, what is one
Yeah.
inch increment in cedar tree bending, right? I
Yes.
don't have the tools to measure it. The variables become much more complicated because it's not like I can say, hey, I covered an 8 foot gap between two tree branches, so I'm going to go find an 8.5 foot gap because the trees aren't aren't the same, right?
Yeah.
They bend differently. They have different textures. They have
Yeah.
different conditions.
Time of the
And
year.
different, exactly. So, so I think there's this saying that I really like, which is not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. And so while having really good tools of measurement creates really profound and powerful feedback systems that can
Mhm.
allow us to optimize processes, they can also actually blind us to the things that we're actually trying to optimize by
Yes.
offering us a local good that is not actually the ultimate good that we're seeking. And so I think we just have to balance those. We have to. Um, I don't reject the classical tools at all. I really like them. I
Yeah.
just think that um, that they're secondary to something greater.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Um,
when we lose sight of that, it damages the practice.
yeah, it's one of my concerns as well that we're putting the forest, well, putting the cart before the horse, or we're losing the forest through the trees.
Yeah,
Um, and I'd like to talk about skill transference later in the conversation, but it's one of the things that you've said, and I've often noticed as well, is that if you have someone who has a broad background in physical movement, let's say someone who's a fairly experienced parkour athlete, and
hmm
you ask them to deadlift, there's a very good chance that they're going to have a 1.5 easy, very good ratio, strength to weight ratio on their deadlift. Whereas
yeah,
I'm speaking for myself now, someone who didn't grow up um, thinking of themselves as athletic, and someone who didn't have a great background in movement when I was growing up. I sort of did it backwards. This was the time of like starting strength and reading Mark Rippetoe, and you only need to, do these three movements. And I got my deadlift relatively high. I got my squat relatively high, and like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to be a really good athlete. And obviously, I still couldn't really jump noticeably further. There was very little transference in terms of me feeling like I was athletically capable, like I could engage with the environment. And I don't know, I guess I didn't want to start this part of the conversation so early, but I think you did a good job of leading up to it. So, yeah, I have a big issue with us defaulting to quantification. I understand why we do it, and I understand why the tools are useful. And like you said, I think it can create a sense of reward and feedback loop. But then, to me, what strikes me is that we've had the modern fitness industry for 40 years, you know? Any one time, I mean, depending on where you want to draw a line in it,
yeah,
I'm thinking, let's say the 80s is, I think, for me, when I think about the gym culture,
yeah, yeah,
when we
yeah.
moved away from
I feel like
bodybuilding, we had,
aerobics and stuff was happening in
yeah,
the early.
exactly. And then all
Yeah,
the, like the big box gyms were existing in the early 90s. And then, because by 2000, Glassman had already kind of started CrossFit as a foil to what he perceived as the shortcomings of the fitness industry, which is,
Yeah.
a whole nother conversation. Um, but any one time in the UK, which is where I am, only 15% of the population has a gym membership. And I think the numbers are probably relatively the same in the States. We know that this idea of saying that movement equals exercise, exercise equals going to the gym means using these machines in a certain prescribed way, you know, improving your overhead press by 2%, on a 16-week cycle or something like that. Not everyone's wired that way. And I would say that it doesn't seem to be, if we want to think of it as an intervention or as a way of looking at things, it doesn't seem to be working in terms of giving people the opportunity for physical movement to really use their bodies. And to me, where I'm coming from, that seems to be one of the biggest challenges that we have. Not the only big challenge, but one of the biggest challenges that I see in society is that people don't have an opportunity to move, and the solutions that we've been trying do not seem to be effective.
Yeah, I agree. That was a big part of my reasoning behind the development of Evolve Move Play, was this sort of sense that fitness was a failed model, right? And my sense was that most people who work, an 8-hour workday don't actually want to go and do another kind of work,
Yeah.
right? So, it's like you get off your here's a uh, an analogy that pops into my mind. Certain people love cars. They really like cars, right? And so they'll happily work all day and go home and tinker with their car and
Mhm.
try to, you know, build their car up, right? Build one car and then build another car, right? But most people don't want to make a practice of looking at their engine and you know
Yeah.
doing all those things. They want their car to be something that gets them from one point to the
Yes.
other and that somebody else takes care of. Right. The last thing they want to do at the end of a workday is go do extra mechanical, dirty work.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people feel that way about their body. Their
Yeah.
body gets them from one place to another, and having a work project that sort of they have to do on their body
Mhm.
in order to have abs or have pecs. It's like they might crave it, and I think that our culture does a lot to manufacture desire for specific body shapes or
Mhm.
capacities, but it doesn't really align with the motivational systems of most people. And my sense was that, well, every child has an inherent drive to play.
Yep.
And so if we tapped into play rather than work as our predominant paradigm of movement, then we get a lot more people moving. Um, my kind of, I suppose that I haven't been so interested in fitness per se, right? Like where my work has evolved has been less about meeting people in the fitness industry and bringing them into movement, and now more about meeting people in movement and helping them understand the
Mm.
power of movement for meaning, or meeting people in the philosophical world and teaching them about the power of the body. And so it really shifts my perspective, and you can kind of look at it and say, Frank French's work has been out there for a long time now. My work's
Yeah.
been out there for a long time now. Daryl Edwards and his
Mhm.
play-based stuff, MoveNat's been out there. Ido Portal's been out there. Um, it's a pretty small drop in the fitness
Yeah.
bucket.
Yeah.
Maybe it's going to explode like CrossFit did,
Yeah.
uh, but maybe not. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe the theory of the case is misguided. Right? The roots of our disembodiment. I think they may not be most easily accessed in this way. I think that
Mm.
the loss of play is maybe downstream of this sort of meaning crisis more
Mm.
broadly, right?
Yeah.
Because um, if you were, if you go back to the 1950s, you might imagine that nobody goes to the gym,
Yep.
right? But they go to a bowling
Yeah.
league.
Yep.
They go to a church. They go to this. And activities are organized through these civic
Hmm.
institutions, the Elks Club, the Masons,
Yep.
the churches, the like Tocqueville's sort of America.
Yeah.
And
Tocqueville, Putnam's work.
yeah, Putnam's work. So it just, trying to think about it humbly in this moment. I'm not sure that the current bubble or like the current pool of people who are willing to start movement
Yep.
um, is a larger pool than the people who are willing to go to the gym,
Yep.
you know? And and I think if we need to change that, we have to sort of change the entire story architecture of what movement is as a culture. And it has to maybe be part of this entire process of just remembering the things that brought us connection as a culture, because we're disconnected from our bodies, and that's really primary to me. But we're also disconnected from each other.
Yep.
And what my work has actually showed me is that most people are actually more desperate for human connection than for anything else that we deliver.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think that, yeah, somehow I think that's where the
Yeah.
real
I mean,
juice.
that's kind of the conclusion that we've come to. I mean, we do physical activity, but really primarily what we do is community building. I mean, really what we found is actually what we do is we try to get people outside face to face, seeing each other. Now I don't know. Have you read Wendell Berry at all?
I haven't. I really should, but
I think you should. I think that Wendell Berry stuff and Paul Kingsnorth has a very good compendium, World Ending Fire, which is I imagine you'd probably find meaningful. But the Wendell Berry quote that I always think of, and it's actually from a speech that he gave in the mid '90s. You know, he was talking about this idea of health, and he talks a lot about people thinking themselves too much as individuals, as islands. You know, he says, the smallest unit of health is the community.
mm,
Um, because we spend so much time thinking of ourselves as isolated beings, but this sort of, I don't know, Ubuntu concept of we gain our meaning by our relationship with everybody else around us. And to me, I think that, and Wendell Berry, he talks about this as well, and this is him writing before the rise of social media, but he said, the general tendency of the modern economy is to essentially insert financial transactions in between human relationships. So you think of how much of the app economy, how much of social media is essentially taking out things that in the past would have been, reciprocal community relationships and then turning them into an app. So I'm sick and I can't cook my food. I don't have it around me, so instead of my neighbor bringing me some soup, I'm going to go ahead and do Uber Eats or whatever. I need someone to give me a ride. I don't have any friends to give me a ride to wherever. And the way this society is built, everything's designed around cars. So because I don't have a car, and you see how that goes. Everything turns in. Anyway, that's kind of been one of the founding principles that we've tried to have, which is really thinking about. Yeah, I think that the basic assumptions of the fitness industry, such as it is, are specifically designed to maximize people's insecurities and their own sense of loneliness. And I don't think that's conscious. I think that's just the way that the market forces have worked out, and everyone said this before, but you know, you get in your car, you drive to the gym, you put your headphones in, and you go ahead and you work out by yourself. And to me, it seems like a missed opportunity because, in the past, so much of physical movement would have been embedded in the context of what you're doing with other people. Not even just you need to be strong to be useful, but like, how can I participate in society? And, whether it's helping to raise a barn or whether it's helping to farm or whether, it's going to a dance or something like that, you communicate with the people around you through this physical being. Um, and it's just, I mean, just going back to what you say, I think you're exactly right. I think that people do need these sort of mediating institutions. They need the equivalent of these Elks Clubs or, church attendance or something. And, I myself I'm not religious, and I haven't felt that sort of calling myself. But that being said, I'm not dismissive of that on either level, because I think church is very important, both from a utilitarian perspective, but also I think there's something to be said about like the deep spiritual needs, that some sort of religious relationship can give people that I think is not being met by society as it's structured right now.
Yeah. For some reason, what comes up for me is actually to like to come back to CrossFit, right? And
Mm,
like how big of a phenomenon CrossFit was and is,
yeah,
what made it so. CrossFit made this really radical set of claims, right? Like I can work out for 10 to 30 minutes a day. And if I just grind my intensity to like insanely high, like
yeah,
within a few years, I'm going to deadlift 700 pounds. Like that's actually
yeah,
what he says, right?
yeah,
You could deadlift like 4 times a year and deadlift 700 pounds in like 3 years, which is
yeah,
absurd.
yeah.
Absolutely not true. It never happened.
No.
Um, and I was listening to a podcast with I think Jason Kalipa. He was talking
Mm,
about the impact of this CrossFit program with Chris Hinshaw,
yeah.
and, and they were talking about the fact that like CrossFit as a theory of physical development has failed its own test.
Mm, yes.
Nobody who trains for the CrossFit Games
Yeah.
uses CrossFit programming.
And we knew that for a long time. I mean, that
Yeah,
was clear 10 years ago.
yeah. So it's like training at high intensity every time that you do an effort is 100% incorrect.
Yes.
Doesn't work, right?
No.
Training with random variation, ineffective.
Yeah.
But why is CrossFit the biggest fitness brand in the world, except maybe yoga? Um, I think what it did was that it's a church.
Yeah, it's a church. It's a church. So that's the same thing. I was a CrossFit coach for 10 years, and it's a church. It's a physical place for people to meet and talk and chat and commiserate. And it gives them some focus, and it's galvanizing. And, the structure is very similar. I think
People
to me, I
feel
think that's
seen by
indisputable.
it, right? They
Yeah.
feel like, and I remember encountering that zeal in
Mm,
CrossFitters, right? Like, there's that old joke, like, how do you know someone's a CrossFitter,
yeah.
right? Don't worry, they'll tell you.
I'll
Um,
tell you. Yeah.
um, and but I think I mentioned this in that article, but it's fundamentally the big box experience is alienating for most people. It
Hmm.
does not address the reality of human connection. But
Yeah.
doing a workout that everybody else in the gym does creates a shared experience of effort that's
Hmm.
deeply meaningful for people. Sweating with 20 other people in the gym taps our social
Yes.
connection networks in a deep way, and competing. And the CrossFit WOD was a brilliant social technology because it created a meta
Mm,
community
yes.
where not only am I experiencing this with you in the gym, we're all experiencing it with everybody else across the world, and we can now compare and have a common grammar of experience. And that's by far been the most like profound change in the fitness world, in the health
Yes.
world in the last 30 years. A gym where you all do the same workout
Yeah.
creates connection.
Yeah. One of the models I always like is I like Seligman's PERMA model, which is just, one of those positive psychology models for thriving. And you could just go down the list of every single thing that CrossFit offers, and it just perfectly fulfills that. And there's other models as well. Various other models that would work. Daniel Pink and people like that. But it's the same thing. You feel like you're a part of something bigger than you. You have the sense of community. You have the sense of relationship. You have the sense of making progress. You have the sense of achieving mastery over something. I mean, it's perfect, and it's. But what that really shows is that's what people don't have in their real lives, and we could go down the rabbit hole of video games and things like that, and sort of um the pernicious effects of how video games can replace that sense of progress and that sense of mastery, while being completely disembodied and not being in any way part of the physical world. But I think probably people have talked about that enough. But it does bother me. I'm trying to think what the term is. All the old ethologists, all uh, the um, the evolutionary biologists like Tenenberg and Conrad Lorenz
Hmm.
with the
Evolve.
birds. So yeah, what's the term I'm thinking of? Surrogate behaviors. Surrogate
Oh,
behaviors. So this idea, that we kind of have these hypernormal stimuli, um,
yeah,
that kind of hijack what would normally be nourishing behaviors, but these hypernormal stimuli are completely disconnected from any of the nourishment that would have normally been part of the evolutionary benefit of that behavior. um
well,
and
junk
I
food.
yeah,
Yeah.
junk food, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Just junk food, any of that stuff, social media to a certain extent.
Oh yeah, parasocial relationships. You know, I you've probably seen this video I put out called "Stimulation versus Nourishment."
No, I
I
missed
think
this one.
I'm quite proud of this video. I put it out in
Yeah.
2016, and I feel like
Hmm.
a lot of people have now articulated what I was trying to say in that video much more sort of in depth. Like a
Mm.
Jonathan Haidt or other folks. But basically, um, was having drinks with my friend Stephan Guyenet,
Hmm.
who's the author of a book called The Hungry Brain. He's a
Yeah.
neurobiology PhD from the University of Washington, who did his postbac research um, on leptin in the brain and the sort of neural mechanisms of obesity. And he told me effectively uh, what the food industry has done is divorce flavor from nutrition.
Yes.
So it used to be that if you wanted to experience sweetness, you had to eat fruit that was packed with vitamins and minerals and water and fiber. But now we can have, an apple flavored, Jolly Rancher, which has none of the benefits
Yeah.
and 10x the sweetness, right? And so, like, that was a real insight cascade for me because as I sat there, I was like, well, that's what
Yes.
pornography is, right? It
Yes.
is, it is this simulation of a really intense sexual image without any of the reality of relationships, which is what
Yep.
makes things connected and meaningful and growth. You know, it's video games, right? Thrill divorced from physicality, right?
Hmm.
I can, every, I live in a cul-de-sac, and just recently, actually, we've kind of reached a critical threshold of boys between the age of 8 and 10 years old.
Yeah.
And now there's like six of them who get together every day. And what they do almost every day is have a Nerf war,
Yeah.
right? Some days they'll play soccer, some days, but usually like the biggest thing that they're choosing to do right now is Nerf war. Um, and when they do that, like it's cold outside right now, they're still out there, right? And so their bodies are adapting to the cold. They're running, they're jumping, they're getting dirty, they're exposing
Yeah.
themselves to uh, soil microbes. They're reading each other's expressions. They're dealing
Hmm.
with conflict, right? They're mad at each other because somebody broke the rules of the game in some way and they have to figure it out themselves. And so many of those dynamics are massively decreased when we move this to an abstracted online space, a virtual space. Um, and so you can see just it's really obvious. If you look at a population of children who don't have access to video games, the way that they play is incredibly health enforcing. And you look at a
Yes.
bunch of kids who play video games, right? Some of them might be healthy, some of them might be inspired by Mirror's Edge or Assassin's Creed to go pick
Hmm.
up parkour, but a large percentage of them look like they just came from, extras on the set of Wally, right? And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
and you can see the pallor on their skin and the
Yeah.
ill health.
And
Um,
even just the way that they interact with each other. So, I've got a
mhm.
similar story in that earlier this year I just made loads of foam swords. I just got some old golf shafts, carbon
Yeah.
fiber golf shafts, wrapped up with pipe insulation. We've got 20 different swords. We got big
Mhm.
claymores and rapiers and, all kinds of things. And we just, put it out there. And it's the same thing. You see the kids playing and, as you said, they navigate their own rules. They kind of calibrate. The older kids have to decide how hard they want to play. Is it worth ending the game if you hit someone too hard, or do you want the game to keep on going, etc. And it's amazing because you realize that the kids, they are capable of all this and they are learning all this without telling them. They come up with coherent rules. They all agree what these rules are, and then the self handicapping that the older kids will do. And you're right. I mean, the video games, they just don't recreate any of that. And also, I mean, I think the most pernicious thing is all that is mediated through a giant corporation. It's almost sometimes I'm afraid to even use the word play when I talk about video games and things like that, because obviously it is a sort of play, it is a kind of expression. But as to your earlier analogy, it's stripped of all that nourishment. And in the same way, if you know any kids that play video games, their
Yeah.
mental state while they're playing video games, yeah, they're not. I mean, they come off and they get very angry and agitated in a way that I think other forms of play generally don't.
Yeah.
I wanted
Look,
to go
says
ahead.
Frank has the simplest diet advice, right?
Yeah,
Eat food, avoid food products.
yeah,
So we can apply the same lens, right? Uh, Pornography is not actual sex; it's a
yeah.
sex product,
Product.
right? Video games are not actual play; they're a play product, right?
They're a
They
play product. Yeah,
stimulate that pathway, or we could call them, you know, junk play. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I don't know where we were going with that when we got
Well,
started.
I wanted to jump back to CrossFit for a second because I thought it was interesting. I haven't kept up with CrossFit. I am, my certification's expired. I don't know, quite a few years ago, so I haven't kind of kept up with where it is. But I did see something the other day saying that CrossFit is definitely receding, and I get the impression. I think maybe its cultural peak. I don't know, was 2014, 2015. I'm not sure, but and it might have been Kalipa who was talking about this with Hinshaw. I'm not sure, but just I've seen that a lot of the old CrossFit athletes are moving over to High Rocks,
Mm, yeah,
and
High
it's
Rocks,
interesting.
it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know anything about High Rocks other than to me it seems like a more cardio conditioning aspect of CrossFit. But it's interesting because to me, not knowing about the organization, I don't know who's behind it, but it seems like in a way it's even more de-skilled. You've taken out what sort of practical, you know, quote unquote functional movements that CrossFit had, and you stripped it where you're almost interacting entirely with some kind of machine or device, whether it's a ski erg or a rowing erg. You have I think these set prescribed movements, and they're just done in different combinations. And it's interesting to me that seems to be what is perhaps overtaking CrossFit now. And I was surprised. I actually felt a little bit sad about it. Again, not knowing anything about it, but I did feel like, oh man, was CrossFit the high watermark with I think with I think the many criticisms one can make about it. Um, I felt very ambivalent about it.
Well, I went to the CrossFit website recently, and I noticed that there was no WOD and no
Mm,
forum anymore.
hmm,
And, so you don't have the same unified experience,
yeah,
right? To the same degree. Um, and then you don't have, I'm sure that it just died in the face of social media eventually.
yeah,
People move on, people age out of that phase of their
mm,
life. They have lots of time to spend on internet forums. And if you don't have, if you're, if you, if that ecosystem is just not going to be replenished because attention's somewhere else, right?
yeah,
Then it fails. But when it fails, it it really hurts the whole model. The same thing
yeah,
happened with the parkour community. Parkour community actually peaked in many ways around 2013, same period
hmm,
of time. And what happened with parkour was, one, we all moved on to social media and the
yeah,
forums dried up. And so it's kind of tragic because a kid who discovers parkour online today cannot go find a forum and immediately find a bunch of local people who he could
yeah,
train with, who want to mentor younger people, who understand the art, who can answer his questions, right? You can find people to follow on Instagram. You can find information.
hmm,
find inspiration. But there's actually nowhere that really holds the communal hub of parkour
Yeah.
anymore. And then the other thing that happened was that YouTube essentially wanted to start competing with Netflix around
Mm,
2013. And so they changed their algorithm to be hyper focused on uh, view time.
yeah.
They wanted to push creators to create really long form content. At the time, a lot of parkour teams had invested in like incredibly high class, uh, you know, camera equipment, and were putting out these incredibly beautiful, like 3-minute reels that would
Mm,
take months and months and months to film to the standard of the athlete.
yeah.
Um, and those in the previous iteration of the algorithm, those things would get millions of views, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden they were tens of thousands of views, and so like all the like people were monetizing and making money off of their YouTube thing, and then all of a sudden it just dried up.
Yeah.
So it's improved now, and stores really kind of like helped bring in a model, but it hit us hard. And then the other thing that happened was that the Ninja Warrior community came in and basically ate our lunch professionally. The
Yeah.
the people who came in and built Ninja Warrior gyms were just better business owners and smarter
Yep.
about business than the kind of young ideologues of the parkour community. Um, and so it you see these same dynamics, and um, it's I think like we train at a ninja gym. My kids are team members on a ninja team, and I love Life Force Ninja, the people there. But to me, there's something a little bit tragic about the fact that it's a ninja gym and not a parkour gym, because I
Yeah.
think fundamentally parkour is more, because parkour invites you to experience the world outside of the gym. Whereas if you want to sort of progress in ninja, it's all towards these man-made circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think you can see something similar happening with CrossFit, where CrossFit was about a sort of really generalized physical competence that you could go take to anything. And if Hyrox is picking it up, Hyrox doesn't have variability of workout. It doesn't have
Mm,
variability of of these modes of modalities, right?
mhm.
Work capacity across broad time and modal domains. Hyrox is one time domain, right?
Yeah.
One like there's multiple modes within it, but it's a super condensed version of what CrossFit offered.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think it's sort of like a dilution of what
Yeah.
was, which is unfortunate. And the algorithm.
Yeah. I mean, it's the algorithm. We're beholden to. Rafe, how much time do you have? I didn't clarify that with you beforehand.
I could probably go for about 20 more minutes.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, then I guess what I'd like to do with the rest of that time is because we've been dancing around it, and I think you make some good points in the generalist mover article, which I
Mhm.
think does a very good job of sort of talking about the history of physical culture in the 20th and 21st century, and then sort of the conversation between the different movements. You include CrossFit, and then you talk about sort of what comes out of CrossFit and movement culture with Ido Portal and everything. I was wondering if you just kind of talk about that article, you know,
Yeah.
and in
So,
conversation with what we've just done.
yeah, let me see if I can summarize it really quickly. There's an interesting moment basically in the 19th century where people start to realize that kind of urban sedentary life is very unhealthy. And so there's this renaissance of physical practices,
Mm,
Swedish gymnastics, German gymnastics, and going back, a lot of that was inspired by rediscovery of the Greeks and the Greek gymnasia. So I guess we go back even to the 17th, 18th century and kind of the origins of this.
mm,
But as we kind of approach the early 20th century, you have Georges Hébert and Méthode Naturelle, and um, this is kind of this is a generalist mover archetype with this idea of being useful to serve society. A lot of these things actually are interestingly tied up with romanticism and nationalism,
mhm,
right? But there's an ethos that's beyond the individual that these things are tied into. One of my favorite authors is very, very poorly known, but her name's Margaret Stryker, and she wrote
Yeah.
about gymnastics and natural movement in the 1930s in Austria. And she was, she presages in many ways things that we're seeing with constraint-led approach now, with my work. She talked about locomotive and manipulative movement and combative movement as part of manipulative movement. Um, and And then you had kind of the golden age of strongmen who were doing really diverse training in the 1920s and before with Eugene Sandow and those guys. And you had Santa Monica Beach and the
Mm.
crazy kind of mix of all these things that was happening. So there's this really diverse, beautiful physical culture that was developing. And then somewhere in like the 1970s, you had bodybuilding and aerobics take over.
Yeah.
And so there was this sort of split of the health versus the aesthetic aspect
Mm.
of it, where the claim was made that all you needed to do for health was the aerobic side. And then it was kind of like, well, maybe, it's just meatheads who do the bodybuilding, right? And then the meatheads got really, really into being meatheads, and
Yeah.
steroids came in, and we
Mm.
had Arnold and the 1980s. And I think of the 1980s as kind of the peak of the specialists, right? Like you
Mm.
ran triathlons or
Yep.
you tried to, look good on stage.
Yeah.
That was where it was. Though there's some interesting things like, American Gladiator and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then CrossFit takes that kind of model of fitness and blows it up and says, hey, we can't just say that the guy who has the greatest, cardiovascular endurance is the fittest, right? Like that's
Mm.
an absurd definition of fitness. And so they create this model of the gymnast, middle distance runner, Olympic lifter as kind of the fitness model. And early on, that model has a lot of gymnastics in it, right? People are doing press to handstands and back extension rolls and pirouettes, and they're supposed to learn the splits, and they're supposed to learn to
Mm.
do flips, and uh, and the parkour is picked up early on in that community, and people are like exploring parkour as part of CrossFit. Um, and then it just gets collapsed down, right? Like
Mm.
it's like the idea of broad time and modal domains becomes narrower and
Yeah.
narrower based on, I think, what is easy to program in boxes with relatively low skill people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and then kind of Ito Portal and myself and Erwan and from MoveNat and other people, Frank's work,
Mm.
Scott Sonnen's work, kind of like exists in sort of the shadow of CrossFit, or on the liminal spaces on the edges of CrossFit,
Mhm.
and starts to create this new culture of like maybe the CrossFit model of the generalist is incomplete. We can go back and we can look at the méthode naturelle thing, right? Ito comes in from a capoeira community and brings in all of that movement, skill, and complexity, right? CrossFit says intensity is king. Ito says
Mm.
complexity is king.
Yeah.
And of course, Ito eventually gets picked up by Conor McGregor. That
Mhm.
becomes this huge, huge thing. Um, but that also seems to be receding to me, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that I don't think that it's stabilized. I think, I don't, I think Ito articulated some really beautiful things, and I think it was really incomplete. Um,
Mm.
so that's my sort of quick history of
Yeah.
it, and then I have my my view of what the real complete movement person is. I don't think it's a gymnast. I think that the parkour athlete is a better model for a truly competent locomotive athlete. And I think ultimately the gymnastics element and the middle distance running element that they're describing is locomotion. And then, obviously the Olympic lifting is the manipulative part. And that's
Mhm.
again, it's kind of insufficient, right? Obviously a strong man is more broadly competent and has more transferable abilities than an Olympic lifter. And then where's the combative? Where's the interactive? Where's the dance? Right? There's a huge lacunae in the CrossFit model
Mm.
around incredibly important parts of physical culture. Um, and so we try to do that. And then the Ito's model is very top down, as is the MoveNet model. It's very much an information processing, top
Yes.
down, hyper controlled model of movement, which I
Yes.
think is mistaken and weirdly not natural.
Yes.
And so we've tried to take the kind of inherent play focused, constraint led stuff that evolves naturally within the parkour community. Parkour just kind of evolves as a really constraint led practice without any theory behind it because it comes out of play.
Yes.
The play theory, the stuff that comes out of Frank Ferencich and Stuart Brown and um, really Jaak Panksepp going back and Jean Piaget becomes really important to our model. And then I think that a lot of there's a lot of disdain in the movement community and in the parkour community for team sport, but I think team sport becomes like once you sort of think about all those layers,
Yeah.
you see that team sport has a huge part to play in creating this truly highly adaptive athlete. So like my kids, um, they have their own personalities and desires. So my oldest daughter, she does a bit of parkour with us and she'll play in roughhouse with her siblings, and she's done martial arts classes, but at 12 now she's like really focused on contemporary dance. That's her passion. She's super
That's cool.
super passionate about it. But my younger two, my youngest daughter and my son, they're doing wrestling, and they're on the ninja team and the wrestling team, and then Kier's doing rugby and flag football as well. And I'm trying to encourage Kaylin to do some rugby, and she also does cheer and tumbling,
Yeah.
which is quite the thing to sort of juggle. But
Yes. A lot of logistics.
that's sort of the model that we're trying to do, and uh, my own training is a lot of parkour these days, a little bit of roughhousing, and some pretty classical strength conditioning stuff to support it. But I'm 42, and I find that trying to optimize across all these things at the same
Yeah.
time is pretty costly. And I've got a lot of other
Yeah.
things going on in my life. So my greatest joy comes in the parkour. So that's where I kind of put most of my development points. And then I just try to
Yeah.
dabble and stay competent in the other areas.
Um, I'm 41 now, and I think because I started on physical stuff later, I always had this feeling that even in my 30s, my late 30s, I was still getting better. I was still getting better. And, I kind of dismissed, some of the effects of aging on, just on recovery. And yeah, as soon as I turned 40, 41, I snapped a bicep tendon, did my back in, and it was just coincidental, but it did make me realize that, I do need to decide how I'm going to distribute all the stressors of training to really prioritize what's important to me. You said something that I think is important, and it kind of ties into the way that I guess I'd like to finish up the conversation, which is you were saying that there's a lot of movement organizations out there. I guess, we can talk about MoveNet as well, which do kind of have like a top down, sort of prescribed approach, and I think just like with CrossFit, I think there are probably incentives and reasons why certain organizations evolve different ways. But one thing that struck me as a challenge is i- if you want to create a system, if you want to systematize something, or if you want to spread it, and I suspect this is something you've thought about as well with your mentorship program, and how you decide that you want to develop coaches. How do you do that in such a way so that you can kind of create fidelity, and feel confident that people can go out the world? But how do you fight that tendency to turn everything into a proprietary system, or systematize things, or turn them into an ABC step program?
Yeah. McDonald's is one of the most successful businesses in the world for a reason,
Hmm.
right? It
Yep.
works. The model works. If you want to make McDonald's money, you might want to do McDonald's shit, right? Uh,
Yes.
I I like making money. Um, I don't like making money more than I like having my soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have chosen repeatedly to take it slow. I was approached by CrossFit headquarters uh, in 2008 about
Wow.
doing a parkour certification
Wow.
through uh, for them, and I was like, I'd love to do a workshop, that was
Hmm.
promoted through CrossFit. That'd be huge, but
Yeah.
I can't call it a cert, right? It's You cannot be a competent parkour coach in a weekend. It's
Hmm.
absurd.
Yep. Yep.
And that's something I really respect about Ito. He's never given into that. He did very briefly for about a weekend. I think it lasted about 1 week. I
Yeah.
was with you in Toronto, and he opened his first like upper body Ito Portal strength cert,
Yeah.
uh, and you know he was like, "No, that's bullshit. I'm not doing that." And so I really respect the fact that he's held his ground on that.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, we've taken a long time to sort of offer a certification because we needed to get to a point where we could bring people in and do a year long thing. So we have a
Mm.
year long online certification process where we're working the first cohort through right now. And the reality of that is that I'm not going to produce coaches very rapidly, right? There are, I think, thousands of MoveNet certified coaches. Um, and this is going to sound really harsh and people are going to be offended by that, but there's not a single one who I'd want to learn from.
Hmm.
Not because of their MoveNet
Yeah.
background at all,
Yeah.
right? Um, so you can take a model and say we're going to produce a lot of coaches.
Yep.
CrossFit did that, and I think CrossFit was more successful with it for some reason. There was some kind of impetus in that. The competitive aspect of it, I think, caused coaches to really focus on optimization
Yeah.
once
I've
they
got
had.
theories about that. Yeah.
Um, but without the competitive aspect, like getting a piece of paper when you have a very low level of confidence, I don't think sends the right signal for what kind of aspiration you should have or what it means to truly be competent. Um, and I think that ultimately that becomes self defeating. I
Mm.
think that what we're seeing is that 15 years into the MoveNat experiment, or 17 years into the MoveNat experiment, very few people are inspired by the experience. Very few people are really growing and aspiring to create something more. What I see, and my feed is really, uh, potentially biased, but the energy and natural movement, a lot of it's coming from Leo Urban and Tarzan movement because
Hmm.
they went and did something that nobody had ever done before, right? They just created something deeply inspiring, and so now people are like, okay, you can you can climb a beech tree 60 feet up and bend it 30 feet and get into another tree. That's
Yeah.
pretty remarkable. And so there's energy there, because it's aspirational.
Yeah.
It's deeply aspirational. And so I see lots of people suddenly picking up movement in trees and movement in nature. Um, and it didn't come from a really honed business model. It
Yeah.
came from people who just devoted themselves to being great at something
Mm.
until it ignited, and I've been in that. I was climbing these things. I was doing the same stuff that Leo was doing, but I was not in an environment that had as much capacity to sway the environment. Or
Yes.
maybe I'm older, or maybe I was just, who knows, whatever. Sometime in the last 4 or 5 years, Leo took it, and like I'm climbing at a V4, and all of a sudden he's climbing V12,
Yeah.
and it's absolutely mind numbing to see. And then all of a sudden he's got 1 million followers, and he's being featured on French TV and traveling all over the world. And um, I don't think Leo is a business guy, right? I don't think
Yeah.
he's really a teacher. He's just incredibly passionate about exploring
Yeah.
just what human beings are capable in that space. And that ultimately, that's how David Bell exploded parkour.
Hmm.
Um, and that's what looks like it's really starting to create a true kind of movement of real passionate growth in natural movement.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like
I think
I'm not sure if I got an answer to your question there, but
no, that's good. Do you have time for one more question, or do you need
sure.
to head out?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do it.
Um, just because we were talking a little bit about getting older, and you were sort of talking about the next generation. So
Mhm.
I was just kind of thinking about about legacy, and legacy is not the right word, but I'll just use legacy as a shorthand. Lasting impact, So with what you do at Evolve, Move, Play, what do you want your long-term impact to be? Like, let's say a generation from now, so let's just say you disappear, you're off the scene. What kind of lasting impact do you hope that you could have?
Yeah. I want to contribute to a culture. I want to be able to look out and see that there's some impact of this culture of being able to love our experience of being here on earth better through having better understanding and connection to all the internal aspects of self, the world around us, the people that we connect to, and the transcendent. That's what I want.
That's great. All right, Rafe Kelley, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Hi, welcome back to the sunny paths of Fife. How was that? I enjoyed that. I think there's something in the... So there are lots of bits in there, and I've written loads in the show notes. There's always something about the roughhousing that I like reading, and I remember when Andrew introduced me to Rafe Kelley probably a good 8 to 10 years ago, and he was talking about roughhousing, and I have I didn't grow up roughhousing, even though I had 3 brothers. I just kind of stayed out of that and watched them, and used to find it really terrifying when they used to fight. And like small boys do a lot of it, and then they get bigger, and then suddenly it's like grown men fighting, and I find that really frightening. And even when occasionally in our falling workshops with our more experienced crews, we might do a bit of, not quite roughhousing, but it sort of depends on the group, but sometimes we do something that sort of approaches roughhousing. I find it really terrifying as an adult, so it's probably an argument that I need to do more of it. But I find that interesting in myself. I thought I'd be more into it, but actually find it really frightening. So that's something for me to take away. Loads in there. I hope you enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the bit around sort of power of movement for meaning, a lot on play. Yeah, just a lot to think about. There's loads on Rafe's website. He's done loads. He's got absolutely tons of courses that you can sign up for. Also check out his YouTube, because he's got loads of really useful resources on there as well. We will be back in a couple of weeks with Tom Morrison, who will be talking to us about mobility and moving more to kind of avoid pain. And that's a really good one. He came to us through Andrew after his back injury. So I think that one will be very interesting and will resonate with a lot of you. Please don't forget to like this podcast and subscribe. I know that everybody says that at the end of the podcast, and it's kind of boring to say, but it makes a big difference. If we've got nice reviews and people subscribing, then our main hosts, which are Spotify and Apple, know that other people want to listen, so then they push it out to other people. So please take a moment, if you enjoyed this episode, to like it and subscribe, or you could even leave a nice little comment if you wanted. All right, put loads more in the show notes, lots of links to Rafe Kelley, check him out, and let's go outside, climb a tree, find a friend to roughhouse with. All right, until next time, bye.